Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this next webinar in the series from the Phytobiomes Alliance. My name is Sally Flis, and I am the Senior Director of Agronomy at the Fertilizer Institute, based in Washington, D.C. I'm going to start today with just a little bit of an introduction of the Phytobiomes Alliance. First of all, a phytobiome is that complex system of plant-based agriculture where we look at these different how the different environments interact for the plants, the soil, the animals, and all the microbes, microfauna, climate, weather, how that all really works together to meet production and environmental goals that we have. And this is all influenced by the management practices that we choose on the landscape. The vision of the Alliance is that by 2050, farmers will have the ability to use predictive and prescriptive analytics based on geophysical and biological conditions for the determination of the best combination of crops and management practices for any given field in any given year. That takes all of these different factors into account. The next webinar that we have coming up is can natural microbiomes be exploited for more sustainable, safe, and productive and nutritious food? And that will be on November 5th at the same time as this webinar, 11 Eastern. The links are here for you to register, and if you'd like more information, please reach out to the Alliance. Just a couple of items to note on how the webinar dashboard works. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the Alliance's YouTube channel in a few days. The presentation section will be followed by a Q&A. We have 3 presenters today, starting with myself. Questions can go in the box you see where there's a question mark in the little bubble. Submit questions in the question and answer and not in the chat panel. You can use the chat panel to talk to fellow attendees or if you have anything to mention to the organizers. There's also downloads of the handouts for the presentations in the handouts panel. And with that, I will begin my presentation today with talking about generally 4R nutrient stewardship. So managing nutrients as a system with 4R nutrient stewardship is the title of the webinar today. I'm going to give a little bit of an overview of 4R nutrient stewardship and some of the work that we're doing at the Fertilizer Institute to help better understand nutrient stewardship practices and advanced nutrient stewardship practices on the landscape. First of all, just a little bit about who the Fertilizer Institute is. We represent the fertilizer industry in the US in public policy, communication, stewardship, and sustainability, while also providing market intelligence needs to fertilizer producers, wholesalers, and retailers. We represent manufacturers and producers of fertilizer, as well as retailers and crop advisors that work on the ground. We are based in Washington, D.C., but we also have a strong focus on research and extension. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, we were able to add a high priority research item in the research title for research and extension grants that explore the source rate, timing, and placement of crop nutrients. Additionally, we have finally got some funding and appropriations bill that's in the House right now to go towards this high priority research item. And so hopefully there will be an appropriations bill sometime that passes and we'll be able to pass along those benefits to researchers like the ones we have on the rest of our webinar today. So starting out with 4R nutrient stewardship, 4R nutrient stewardship is selecting the right source, rate, timing, and placement of any nutrients that we're applying to a field so that we can match the needs of the crop from both an amount and a timing and a placement aspect so that the crop is taking up as many of the nutrients that we apply as possible. But as with the phytobiomes concept, 4R nutrient stewardship is more than just selecting a source, rate, timing, and placement of nutrient application. We need to be sure we're considering our soil characteristics, soil type, water holding capacity, soil moisture, any other site-specific information like the slope of the land, the distance to water, other conservation practices like cover crops or tillage practices that are occurring in that field. And what are our crop yield and quality goals? As mentioned in the earlier slide, weather has an impact on this, and unfortunately is the one factor we can't control, but it's something that tools are evolving for to allow us to be able to make the best nutrient application plans as we can. And finally, what is it going to cost that producer is really the biggest question on the producer side that influences which practices are selected and how and when a producer is going to choose to implement them. One of the things we're able to measure with the projects we have coming online right now are some environmental metrics, and we can look at these at a farm level or at a program level based on which practice or which program that we're working on, that we're talking about. So at a farm level, in some of our case study work, we're able to look at some of the metrics like nitrogen balance, nitrogen use efficiency, emissions, and cost per acre. At some of our programmatic levels, we can look at total acres that are under a different management program, individual practices that are across different number of acres, and total changes in nutrient use. Now I'm just going to go through some of the different 4R programs that we're working on at the Fertilizer Institute. And the first one is through our Foundation for Agronomic Research, is the 4R Research Fund. And the projects that you're going to hear about after my presentation have both been supported by the 4R Research Fund. Overall, we've supported about 12 different projects with the dollars that we've taken in. This is money that our members contribute above and beyond their membership dues to about $11 million they've contributed right now to fund projects in the US and Canada. TFI works with the US projects, and Fertilizer Canada, which is our equivalent association in Canada, works with the Canadian projects. So you'll see we started out with some meta-analysis papers, which Alison was part of one of those, as well as the project she's going to discuss today, to look at what is the research that's needed. So we weren't just spending money on not answering the key questions. Since then, we've funded about 12 in-field projects, one of which is a multi-site project, and that is the Nitrate-N collaboration that Alison will be talking about, with sites in 5 different states and 1 in Ontario. And then in 2019, we moved away from projects only based in the Corn Belt, looking at corn and soybean rotations, to some more variety in the crops that we're supporting. And that's where Hunter's presentation comes in on cotton project that he's working on. Another program that we have that we use to help figure out what are farmers really doing in the field is our 4R Advocate program. This program recognizes 5 pairs of a farmer and their crop consultant every year that are doing above and beyond nutrient management practices in the field. These were our 2020 4R advocates, and just to point out some of the variety that we have and that 4Rs really apply across all production systems. In this slide, the top left is a sugar beet soybean corn grain farmer in Minnesota. The longer picture next to him, they grow about 20,000 acres in Florida, and they grow sugarcane, sweet corn, and a variety of other specialty crops. The picture in the middle is an orchard in Maryland, Virginia area, and they grow orchard crops and some vegetables. We've got on the bottom left a farm in Missouri. He's about 8,000 acres of corn and soybean rotation. And then the last one is a cotton grower in Texas, and he has, I can't remember his acreage off the top of my head, but he is producing both organic and conventional cotton. And so it's really interesting to visit with him about the different aspects of those 2 production systems. The third program that I work a lot on is our 4R Nutrient Stewardship Certification Program. This certifies ag retailers in states that have developed the program for a set of standards based on scientific framework around nutrient management that they're educating, keeping records, and making recommendations based on 4R principles. It was started in the Western Lake Erie Basin and has continued to expand. And currently in the US, we have the program in Ohio, the pieces of the west of Michigan and Indiana that touch the Western Lake Erie Basin, New York, Florida, and Canada. And New York and Canada, Canada is in Ontario and Prince Edward Island, have certified locations for a total of almost 4 million acres across these programs that we can say are under different 4R practices that are appropriate for the areas that these farmers are operating in. In the beginning, I mentioned the question of cost being probably the most important one to a farmer is how are they going to make these practice changes in order to improve their operation and reduce their environmental impact and make these systems work together. The number one thing that both farmers and their crop consultants mentioned when we did a survey was they want to improve their farm operation profitability, but they see as barriers to adoption. Are they going to need new equipment to make these practice changes? What's going to be the difference in labor or time or the expertise that they might need in order to make these practice changes? And consistently, farmers answer in surveys that the top two sources of information on fertilizer use and practices is their agronomist or their retail fertilizer dealer retailer that they work with. So we've just went about creating some case studies to look at how much does it cost to do different for our practices and advance our practice implementation on the ground. There are now 13 case studies posted at forourfarming.org from a whole variety of crops and different production systems. I'm just going to go into one a little bit to give you a flavor of what type of information is available in those case studies. So what we've done is work with those 4 advocates that I mentioned earlier and look over 4 years of time, how did costs change as they went from basic to advanced nutrient management practices. And this slide will give you an example of basic versus advanced. Basic practices are really kind of run-of-the-mill standard grower standard practice for an area where there's probably less management and time involved. We're applying nutrients out of season, maybe not soil sampling as intensively. And as we move to the advanced practices, you can see this grower is applying nitrogen 4 times a year and using tools to monitor that nitrogen status through the year. They're using inhibitor products in order to reduce nitrogen loss when they apply different types of nitrogen. And it's not mentioned here, well, a little bit in the grid versus zone. They're also testing out different methods of soil sampling and establishing production levels across their field. And what we found is that over this 4-year time, the grower reduced the cost of implementing nutrient management practices by $15 to $24 an acre, depending on the 2 systems. The difference in cost here between the grid and zone is really the consultant, that expertise cost that I mentioned in the earlier slide of using the zone management versus the grid management system. Additionally, for these case studies, we're also able to calculate some of those field level or farm level metrics. And so we're able to calculate nitrogen use efficiency, nitrogen balance, and the reduction in carbon emission equivalents. So here you can see that nitrogen use efficiency is now below 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of corn, which I'll get into a little more about that in the next slide, because this is getting to be kind of a low number. Kind of average or standard recommendation is 1.2 pounds of nitrogen per bushel of corn grain, kind of a historically used number by producers. 0.8 is getting to the point where we are probably starting to maybe see some negative impacts on the rest of the phytobiome, the microbes in the soil, the organic matter available, taking nitrogen back out of the soil versus building carbon and nitrogen in the soil. So it's something to keep an eye on as we look to gain efficiencies on these farms. But you can see that when we take all of his practices into account and the changes he made in both rate and other 4R practices, we can see almost a 35% decrease in carbon equivalent emissions on this farm. Just a little more on the nitrogen use efficiency piece. So as I mentioned, this the nitrogen use efficiency piece on the previous slide, that number is calculated in a way that is related to nitrogen recommendations. The International Nitrogen Expert Panel calculates it slightly different. They look at total nitrogen harvested divided by total nitrogen applied rather than using a yield metric like bushels per acre. And you'll see the same thing. There's the same number, the same farm, same years calculated here, that as we get out to 2017 and that really high efficiency, we're getting into this range that we're risking mining soil nitrogen, which is going to change the balance and the activity of those other aspects of the phytobiome that make for a strong, high-yielding, efficient plant. Overall, we've done these case studies. I have data on 6 different operations in 6 different states, and we consistently see that as farms go from basic to advanced practice, they're saving money per acre, and they're reducing their CO2 emissions by anywhere from 10 to 30, almost 35% for the year. So differences in yields across the different production systems, mostly due to weather and soil type, but all farms that are within the expected yield range for those different areas. As I mentioned, there's other crops available at 4rfarming.org, everything from strawberries to some more coming on from Wisconsin, looking at corn silage and more diverse cover crop rotations and the addition of manure nutrients in those systems as well. With that, that's the end of my presentation on kind of where the Fertilizer Institute is for our practices, for our analysis, and different programs we have going on. Here's some resources for more information. And our next presenter up is Alison Eagle with the Environmental Defense Fund to talk about a project, the Nitrate-N project that she has been working on with, that is partially funded from the 4R Research Fund and partially funded from the Foundation for Agronomic, the FR, which I can't remember all the abbreviations for, so hopefully she can, there she's got a Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research. So Alison, I will let you take the lead now.
Okay, thank you, Sally. I'm just going to move one window over so I can see things better. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. I'm based in EDF's North Carolina office, but along with the rest of our Working Lands team, my work focuses on production agriculture across the country and even outside of the United States. For this research work, I'd like to acknowledge collaborators at multiple universities and government research facilities, and especially Lori Abendroth and Ty Maz, listed here at the bottom of the screen, who have been involved in the data and synthesis. We use fertilizer of different kinds, including synthetic sources and manure, to sustain high crop productivity. This figure is from a recent paper that our team published in the journal Bioscience. Farmers and the rest of society want to see more of that fertilizer go into the crop and less of the fertilizer being lost to the environment. So we depicted that here in that there are these different pathways in where the fertilizer can go. However, we end up with different people working in different parts of this whole system. For example, agronomists and farmers look at ways to improve yield and get the fertilizer into the crop plants. Other people end up being concerned about losses to the air. So there's the atmospheric science. So we have losses like nitrous oxide, a significant greenhouse gas, or ammonia, which causes air pollution, and PM 2.5 and problems in certain regions, as well as depositing nitrogen in natural systems that can be sensitive to extra nitrogen. Then we have people working on soil science, which is my background, and we're thinking about the nutrient cycling within the soil and sometimes relating that to the agronomy. And then hydrologists and agricultural engineers look at the water and what happens to the nitrogen, phosphorus, etc., as it goes into the water, especially in tile drain systems in the Midwest, where we use those tile drains to make it possible to farm in those areas. So there are often these walls between these different groups of people, and so they cannot see how what they are doing affects the other parts of the system. We could push on a lever to increase yield, for example, and end up causing environmental challenges. Or we could do something intended to reduce nitrate losses and inadvertently increase nitrous oxide emissions. Therefore, we need to try to manage these nutrients as a system, and in that way, we need to break down these walls, or maybe even change them into bridges. In that case, we may want to also consider including decision makers and other actors like those in economics and policy. So this is just setting the frame for why this is all important. As Sally mentioned, in 2014 and 2015, the 4R Research Fund supported different teams of researchers to sort through some of the existing research data in order to identify the impacts of 4R nutrient management on production and on environmental outcomes. These teams identified some impact of management and weather and soil on a number of different outcomes of interest, including crop yield and nitrogen losses through either nitrate or nitrous oxide, as well as phosphorus losses. However, in many cases, we found that data couldn't be used because yield information was missing or nitrogen rate information was missing and other things like that. And that really reduced the value of the data from those primary research studies to be used anywhere beyond that initial research study. In other cases, key practices or conditions like the weather or even the location of the study weren't known or just were not reported. And methods, units, sample timing, things like that were highly variable, and so it was difficult to compare one study to another, or they were unclear and just not reported. And in addition to that, there were very few studies that measured more than one loss. So trying to find studies that measured nutrient losses as well as crop yield was the first challenge. And then trying to find studies that measured more than one loss at the same time was nearly impossible. We wrote about these challenges and encouraged researchers to try to standardize their data collection and reporting to fill in the gaps and to build some of these bridges that we need to build between the different silos of study. As an example of the data gaps, this is a map from the meta-analysis that my team was involved in. And we looked at nutrient losses, at nitrogen losses from corn-based systems across the whole US. The green areas on this map show where corn is grown. And you can see some gaps, like in California or in other parts of the West, across the South and Southeast, where there were no studies available that measured both yield and any kind of nitrogen losses. In addition, there are some significant gaps in, you can see very few overlaps of nitrate and nitrous oxide observations, the nitrate observations being the ones that are blue circles, and the studies that measured nitrous oxide were the red circles. In some cases, there were study sites that measured both of those, but they were very rarely reported at the same time. So if you become a really good sleuth, you might be able to find a paper that someone published and then their colleague published another one. And then you try to put all those data together. But it would be much easier if that could be done at the beginning instead of at the end being a detective. So seeing an opportunity to begin to address these issues, a group of researchers across the Corn Belt got together to look for resources that would support a new collaboration. This we named Nutrient, nutrient management and a network. And for this project, we have a systematic, multi-site and multi-outcome set of field research. We coordinate across the sites, we meet regularly, we're measuring crop production, multiple nutrient losses at the same time, and also measuring soil health outcomes. The study has been going on starting in October 2017 and continues, and 6 of the 8 sites actually had historical data, so they were established drainage sites with all of which have tile drainage, and then we are able to measure other outcomes at the same time. I'll show you a map. On this map, you can see the different locations of our studies. They include going from Minneapolis, or from Minnesota, all the way through to the very southern tip of Ontario in a nice U shape. Different sites are measuring different management practices. So some of them are comparing different tillage treatments. Some of them are looking at different crop rotations. A number of them are looking at cover crops, and all of the different sites are measuring 4R practices of some sort. So we have sources, rate, timing, and placement for nutrient application. And at all of these sites, we're measuring multiple outcomes. We're, of course, interested in the agronomic outcomes. How do yields respond to different management practices? And the soil health outcomes being the blue circles for each site. You can see those being measured. And we are measuring nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium losses in the water. That's these colored circles that are overlapping one another, measured at the same time in drainage water. A number of sites are measuring ammonia emissions in the gray, and then most of them are also measuring nitrous oxide emissions. And so we're then able to tell with these, we can start to examine trade-offs and synergies. When might we be pushing on a lever that addresses nitrate losses and inadvertently increases nitrous oxide emissions, for example? To manage all the data and bring everybody together, we established some significant protocols, data dictionaries, meaning that we have that everybody reports the same variables, the same using the same units, so that everybody's reporting in grams per kilogram or pounds of nitrogen per acre, and making sure they at least note what units they're reporting in. Yields are reported in standard moisture content, unlike some of the historical data for which we don't know what the moisture content was for the yield and things like that. So we've established these research standards by speaking together and working together over the years as a team. And then we're able to use an online portal using a Google platform to collect the data. And then the data are quality checked by our team that's at Iowa State University. And we have conversations with the field research teams to discuss things that might seem to be unusual or just questions about the data. And this enables us to have far higher quality data than what would otherwise be available. After the first year of a few bits and starts, then people have said that this has made it much easier for them actually in the end to be keeping track of their data, because the format is standardized. Everybody knows what kind of calculations they're doing in order to put the data in. And then in the end, we end up with a high quality multi-site set of data that we can pull out and export the data from all the different sites in order to do synthesis across all of these different sites. And it ends up being much more nimble and able to work with data at a much earlier time frame than usually is available when you're looking across different research sites. So I'm going to just show a few different results here, and just so you can see some of what we've managed to do. We have, like I said, a lot of different treatments, and yet even though some sites have, up to 5 or 6 different treatments, we're able to group them together into 3 basic buckets. First one being the red, being farmer normal, the farmer normal practice for that region, identified by the researchers as this is the typical farmer practice. Then we have the first 4R practice, the gray one, which is applying one improved management aspect. So that's either shifting timing or using a nitrification inhibitor or some other method that is improving the management of most often nitrogen fertilizer. And then the 4R advanced, being the blue, blue bars are applying more than one different change to improve more than one of the R's, of the 4 R's. And in some cases, that also includes using cover crops or some other type of management that, that would be an improved management system. So we have across the bottom of this graph, we have the different research sites. This is an average of 2018 and 2019 for corn yield. 2 different sites only had corn in 2018, they had soybean in 2019. And overall, we actually don't see an impact on corn yield if we look at the average overall. Even though in 2018, we saw an increase in yield from the 4R advanced treatments, and in 2019, we saw a slight decrease in the 4R advanced treatments. 2019 also had much lower yields than in 2018, which, as many of you may remember, was a challenging year for growing anything in the Midwest. 4R management also reduced nitrate losses, and we can see here the yellow are the 0 nitrogen treatments, so those are not going to be seen on any farm, of course, but they're just there for comparison to see the background losses. And we can see on average, we have a reduction in nitrate losses. This is an average of corn and soy plots, as well as 2018 and 2019. On average, we have a reduction of nitrate losses by about 5 pounds of nitrogen per acre using the 4R advanced management practices. Soybean also has less losses on average than the corn in the soybean year. And then finally, I'm going to show this graph where we can see that we have different ratios of nitrous oxide to nitrate losses. So this is in total pounds of nitrogen per acre. The light part of the bar is the nitrate losses, and the dark part of the bar is the nitrous oxide, and we have farmer normal, 4R, and 4R advanced again. And basically, this is just to show that in some sites, like this subsurf site, we have far more nitrate loss than nitrous oxide. And in other cases, we have quite a different situation where the nitrous oxide losses are higher and starting to even approach more than nitrate losses. And it depends on the year, depends on the rainfall and all that. But getting an understanding of this relationship is something that we were unable to do before this because we weren't measuring these things both at the same time. So to manage nutrients as a system, we really need quality data, available data that gets published and is not stored in somebody's old computer files that can't be accessed anymore. We also need useful metrics like nitrogen balance that Sally mentioned earlier. And we have another recent paper that looks at using nitrogen balance to quantify on-farm nitrous oxide emission reductions. Nitrogen balance is also being that it's the nitrogen input minus outputs. It's a way to avoid the inadvertent trade-offs of losing nitrate, losing more nitrate if you've dealt with nitrous oxide, for example, because both nitrate and nitrous oxide and ammonia emissions can be managed by managing nitrogen balance effectively. We also, of course, need innovative managers, and we have farmers who are trying a lot of different new things and are willing to experiment on their farms, and that innovation is essential for success of managing nutrients as a system. So I would like to end here with thanking the funders, and these are all the institutions where collaborators are located for this project. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Allison. Just as a reminder, the Q&A box is open already for questions for the end of our presentation, our session, and the next presentation is from Dr. William Hunter Frame from Virginia Tech about some cotton-specific work that he's doing as part of other 4R Research Fund projects.
Thank you, Sally. So I'm going to be talking about a project that we have ongoing here, not just here at Virginia Tech, but also in Georgia, in Tennessee, and at Texas A&M. My colleagues that we submitted a proposal for, and we're looking at refining the nitrogen recommendations, and what does that mean for cotton production? Cotton has a reputation of being maybe a dirty crop environmentally, and so we want to kind of clean that up in terms of increasing nitrogen use efficiency. I just have some statistics here for cotton. In 2017, 373,000 metric tons of nitrogen were applied to cotton. Roughly 43% of that was actually taken up by that cotton crop as an average estimate. So that's greater than 200,000 metric tons of nitrogen being lost to the environment in 2017. And so how do we use the 4Rs to increase that nitrogen use efficiency across the United States cotton belt and across in the world, really? How do we increase that in cotton? And do the nitrogen recommendations currently in the U.S. across the states, they really are we mining nitrogen, as Sally mentioned in her presentation, or are we using too much nitrogen? So we wanted to fine tune those recommendations. And so these are the current nitrogen recommendations across the U.S. and you see they fluctuate quite a bit. I would say there's probably anywhere from 30 to 40% fluctuation depending on the states. Alabama's at 101 kilograms, Florida's at 67 kilograms per hectare, split applications. Mississippi's 56 to 67. North Carolina's in that same ballpark. Virginia, we use a yield-based goal, and I'll get into a little bit of why we use yield-based goal. So that's 56 kilograms of nitrogen per bale, and a bale is 480 pounds of lint. But that's taken into account of what's actually in the soil, and I'll talk a little bit here in a minute about measuring agronomic efficiency versus nitrogen use efficiency in the studies that we're conducting across the cotton belt. Tennessee breaks it out on soil types, but again, 34 kilograms of N per hectare, that's not a lot of nitrogen to make a cotton crop, especially some of the cotton crops that can be made in a state like Tennessee. We're talking close to 2,000 kilograms of lint per hectare in a state like Tennessee. And then Texas has a straight yield goal, 50 kilograms of N per bale estimate for Texas, where the majority of the cotton in the U.S. is grown. Whenever I give a talk on 4Rs of nutrient management, I always use this slide and I always remind producers that, yeah, we want to be economical. We want to make sure we don't over-apply nitrogen. But as Alison just talked about, a lot about the environmental aspect and then the social aspect. Doesn't do any good to be over-applying or to misuse these fertilizers and having a negative environmental impact. And I always, in my talks, I talk about a 98-2 rule. So 98% of the population is not directly involved in food production. Only 2% is directly involved in food production. But when it comes to policy making in Washington and in state governments, that 98% is going to have a much louder voice. So farmers have to get ahead of some of the issues environmentally and socially and use some of these technologies and different strategies to maximize nitrogen use efficiency in all crops, not just cotton. But we're going to talk a little bit about our proposal to the 4R Fund and to the Foundation Agronomic Research to look at cotton and nitrogen use. So the 2019, we submitted a proposal and it had 4 specific objectives. The first objective was to quantify nitrogen rates, cotton response to nitrogen rates and placement strategies for contemporary varieties across the major production regions. And we had 4 locations. 2019 was the start of the project and it ran to 2021. The second objective is we want to determine the impact of EEFs, and EEF stands for Enhanced Efficiency Fertilizer. So products that contain NBPT like Agritane, Arborite Ag, and there's some other products out there that contain NBPT now. Nitrification inhibitors like nitropyrin, Centuro is another nitrification inhibitor. Instinct 2 contains nitropyrin. But we want to look at these and their influence on nitrogen use efficiency and also agronomic efficiency in cotton production. In conjunction with just the yield and the uptake, we're also looking at gases loss of nitrogen in these studies. And we're doing this in Virginia and West Texas. And we're looking at various losses of nitrogen in terms of greenhouse gas species, ammonium, CO2 emissions, water vapor, carbon monoxide, and we're using a gas mat technology. This is an infrared spectroscopy portable device to measure all of these gases simultaneously at certain intervals after nitrogen application. And then we also want to quantify the effectiveness of these current stabilizers, these EEFs, on their and slow and controlled release fertilizers on their release and transformations in the relative soil types across the cotton belt. And so we're actually looking specifically at ammonia volatilization, and I'll share some results from Virginia. But we're looking at A horizons, which are topsoils, and at 4 different locations across the United States. And we have soils sent to us, and we air dry those soils so they store properly, and then re-wet them for these trials. And then we want to measure. The third objective is measure the impacts of various cover crops. We've been working with cover crops quite a bit. NRCS is pushing them nationwide. And so we want to look at how we can use legume covers in conjunction with small grain cover crops to really push yields and to reduce our nitrogen fertilization with inorganic fertilizers in these cotton production systems. And the last objective for this whole project is develop a comprehensive management guide for cotton producers from Texas to Virginia in terms of how they manage and to maximize nitrogen in their environments and in their management systems. So these are just our study locations: Virginia, Georgia, Tennessee, and then West Texas and Lubbock with Texas A&M. So the first set of trials I talked about, we looked at placement and then also rate of nitrogen fertilizer. So we had a broadcast, which was a dry granular urea blend with ammonium sulfate, a surface band application, which was a fluid source of UAN 32% blended with ammonium thiosulfate for sulfur. And then the injection was that same UAN ammonium thiosulfate. We looked at applied rates of 6 rates, a 0, a 45, 90, 135, 180, all the way up to 225 kilograms N per hectare, which is well above most of the state's recommended nitrogen rates. And we wanted to see what the response curve was for each state. And I'm going to show some preliminary data that Virginia had that's published in Agronomy Journal. So this is a broadcast curve over 6 sites and over 3 years for Virginia that really wanted me to look at this study across environments. And we see that we have a good response curve here with relative lint yield. However, we did not plateau with broadcast urea treatments. This is surface broadcast, not incorporated, split applications with 25% of nitrogen at planting, 75% at side dress, which is, if you know cotton production, that's at first square, which is a cotton's probably 17, 18 inches tall. The optimal N rate was greater than 180 kilograms of N per hectare, and a relative maximum yield of 94%, which equals about 1,600 kilograms per hectare. When we moved to a liquid system or UAN system, we saw that our optimal N rate was reduced from greater than 180 down to 128 kilograms. So we picked up some efficiency just by changing source and placement. This was still applied on the surface. However, we went from a dry broadcast to a fluid system. And again, within 50 kilograms of lint was very similar in yield by reducing by about 40 to 50 pounds or 40 to 50 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. When we further adjusted the placement and actually put the UAN below the soil surface, we had roughly the same optimal N rate, but we actually increased by 60 kilograms of lint to the acre, or 5% yield increase by putting that in a subsurface band or injecting that below the soil surface about 15 centimeters to the side of the row. And so we see that there's some efficiency gain just by simply changing your source and changing your placement in cotton production. And this is what started the discussion for the proposal to the 4R fund and how we can maximize nitrogen in cotton systems. This is 2019 data, a very similar response curve. Here we see the yields are maximized around that 135 kilograms into the per hectare rate. There was no difference in 2019 in Virginia in terms of placement or source of fertilizer. So injected performed very similar to urea and then very similar to surface applied UAN. Interesting point about the different sources is we wanted each site to use their best management practices for nitrogen. Well, in West Texas, for urea, a broadcast system, that's a single shot or single application at planting of that granular fertilizer. And we found out that anything above 135 kilograms in per hectare in West Texas of straight urea actually will prevent cotton from emerging due to ammonium toxicity in the soil. So we actually did not get any cotton in the broadcast treatments at the higher nitrogen rates because of adverse effects of ammonium toxicity and ammonia effects on the seed itself. So that's an interesting fact that we found out in 2019, and we adjusted that for the 2020 season. When we looked at the enhanced efficiency fertilizers, and this is a busy slide and it's hard to read the x-axis, and I apologize for that. We started out in 2019 looking at static greenhouse chambers as well as the gas mat. What we found with the static chambers for measuring greenhouse gases were the time that we sampled the gases within the vials to the time we could analyze them, it just was very inaccurate and very inconsistent in terms of measuring greenhouse gas emissions of static chambers compared to the gas mat, where you're getting a real-time flux with that FTIR system in the field. We're able to detect methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, carbon dioxide simultaneous with the gas mat. I can tell I'm not going to present any gas loss data, but in the untreated urea plots at 24 hours after N application here in Virginia, we saw our ammonia flux go from 0 parts per million at the initial reading all the way to 30 parts per million in the air 24 hours after nitrogen application at side dress. So we did see differences among treatments and enhanced efficiency fertilizers in terms of ammonia loss on our soils. This graph though is lint yield. The blue bars are 100 kilograms of nitrogen to the hectare application rate. The orange bars are 60 kilograms of nitrogen to the hectare application rate. And what I want to point out is on these to the left here, we see this is comparing it to the untreated control. So we subtracted out. This is agronomic use efficiency. So it's kilograms of lint versus kilograms in over kilograms in applied. For untreated urea surface broadcast at 100 kilograms of nitrogen to the hectare, we see that we get a use efficiency of 5.28 kilograms of lint per pound of nitrogen applied. When we went to the dribble system, we increased that to a little above 6, and then injected, it was around 5.72. So again, we see that efficiency that we've seen in Virginia with just changing placement and source. We see a little bit higher use efficiency. When we add NBPT, which is a control for ammonia volatilization, this is urea with NBPT, and that use efficiency goes from 5.28 to 6.4. And we typically will see that, and we'll show in the next graph in our lab trials. But that NBPT is preventing ammonia volatilization, which in Virginia is our dominant loss of nitrogen on urea-based fertilizers when they're surface applied. When we actually add a nitrification inhibitor, that use efficiency actually decreases down to 4.28. So we actually lose a kilogram of lint per kilogram of nitrogen applied, by putting a nitrification inhibitor on urea, which inhibits nitrate production by inhibiting the microbes in the soil. So again, we see lower nitrogen rates having the higher use efficiencies would make sense. We're just not optimizing or maximizing yields at those lower nitrogen rates, but we're getting a bigger return for the amount of nitrogen we're applying. This is our ammonia volatilization. So I mentioned that ammonia loss in Virginia is our dominant loss mechanism for surface applied urea fertilizers. The chart on the left, this top bar here is the untreated broadcast urea. So we lost about 35 to 40% of the nitrogen. And to reaffirm what we saw with nitropyrin, if the chart on the right, the open circles are urea plus nitropyrin, which is nitrification inhibitor, and our cumulative loss actually goes up to 50% of applied N. And then we see the different placement strategies. When we subsurface apply urea or UAN solutions, we see we drastically reduce the amount of ammonia loss in our systems. When we add urease inhibitors such as NBPT, we reduce the loss of ammonia as well. However, it's not as effective as actually just changing the placement of those fertilizers, which is interesting to me. The inhibitors give us some effect, but they're not as effective in total loss of ammonia during a 2-week lab trial. Moving into cover crops, and I know I'm going quickly. This is from 2 years of a study we have ongoing, and this is kind of replicated in our 4R grant across 4 sites across the cotton belt. But really what I wanted to point out here is that with a legume cover, the dashed top line, we maximize lint yields at 110 kilograms nitrogen per hectare. However, we had similar lint yields with as low as 45 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. Nothing really approached the yield levels at lower N rates for the different types of other cover crops or fallow system. So we've been very successful at producing a high amount of cotton or large quantities of cotton with no nitrogen or very little amounts of nitrogen when we have a legume cover crop in the system, which is interesting because cotton following corn in our environment, we're able to get legume cover crops planted early and get large amounts of nitrogen in legume biomasses, which are in turn showing that we can have a system where maybe we can achieve no nitrogen being applied in this system. So with that, the expected outcomes for the grant moving forward is we want to optimize the nitrogen rates. Is that going to be 134 kilograms in the southeast? Is that going to be 67 kilograms in the mid-south, which is the Tennessee, Mississippi Delta area? And then how does this change if we're growing mid and late maturing varieties versus an early maturing variety? And then we're also looking at how these enhanced efficiency fertilizers, what's the best placement strategies, but also the best use of these EEFs in our cotton systems, and or just the general soil types. These things can be really used on specific soil types, not as much as in a cropping system. How they perform in cotton is going to be very similar on that soil, how they perform in corn. And then incorporating legume cover crops, how can we scale this up to the farm level? We're working on that. It's funded by Cotton Incorporated right now, but we've been very successful using legume cover crops in Virginia, and we want to see if that translates to other areas of the U.S. cotton belt. And then ultimately develop this nitrogen guide for the U.S. cotton belt. And with that, I'd like to just thank the Fertilizer Institute and then the Foundation for Agronomic Research for funding this work.
Thanks, Hunter. And Allison, if you could rejoin us. And I'm just going to put back up for you guys, for the audience to see some of the resources that are available. And I posted in the chat the link to the website where all the information or reports are available on the projects discussed today, in addition to other projects that we funded. So we don't have too much time left for questions, but one question I have for both of you guys is, you both touched on it a little bit, is how do these other factors, what do you feel is kind of the most sort of your number one and number two factor that influence the outcomes of the projects you guys have been working on. And we'll start with
I'll go
Alison.
first. Yes, I would say that, of course, one of the most important factors is weather, but we can't control the weather. And so then we look for what are the factors that we can control and that we can do something about. And with regard to nitrogen management, many different things can work to improve nitrogen use efficiency and bring down a low nitrogen, bring down a high nitrogen balance so that we're reducing losses and getting at that optimum, getting where we have the yield where we want it to be and reducing the risk of losses. So it depends on where you are. And that's why the innovative farmers, I brought that up because we can try different things in different places. And like Hunter said, you know, in some places where it's dry, ammonia losses are more of a problem. And in other places, we've got more of our nitrogen being lost through nitrate leaching in especially these tile drain systems. So we need different practices for different places. And all of them can be integrated in something like nitrogen balance.
Sure. Anything to add to Hunter?
No, I agree with that. Weather is probably in terms of getting the results we need, is the number one, I guess I would say nemesis, but that, you know, that it'll hamstring a project quick, especially when you're talking with gas. Gas is loss of nitrogen. If you get a huge rainfall event right after you apply the nitrogen, it could be a problem. I would say just coordinating, especially when you're working across environments as diverse as Virginia and South Georgia to West Texas, is coordinating what are the best management practices and trying to set up protocols that are consistent enough that we can test these hypotheses we have across the environments.
Thanks, guys. One question for both projects. Are you, either of you, measuring any of the soil health types of tests that are out there? I know there's a huge variety of them, but is that anything that either of the projects are looking at?
Yes, that's a part of the project that we're on. So we are taking soil health measures across all of the sites and all of the treatments. Because soil health can take a while for any kind of changes to be observable, then those samples were taken at the very beginning of the project in the fall of 2017, and they will be compared to the samples that are being collected right now in the fall of 2020.
And Hunter, any soil health samples for the cotton work? All right, well, Hunter, we'll look for you to follow up with us. Looks like we've got some technical difficulties. Anyways, we have just about reached the end of our time, and I'd like to thank Hunter and Alison both for joining us today. As I mentioned, there's more information available on these specific projects at our 4rresearch.org website. Additionally, the other resources that you still see on your screen have got information about all the other programs around 4R nutrient stewardship that I covered in my presentation. My email is sflis@tfi.org if people have questions specifically, or if you want help getting in touch with any of the research projects we covered today. So we would like to thank Phytobiomes Alliance for the partnership, and we hope you enjoyed the session.